Are the foods you're eating sabotaging your thyroid health? And if so, which foods? In today's episode of Thyroid-Healthy Bites, we're going to take a deep dive into the top 5 foods and drinks that might be worth avoiding if you have a thyroid condition. We're going to break down the science behind why these common dietary culprits could be affecting your energy, gut health, and thyroid function. You'll also hear some real-life stories, practical tips for making these changes manageable, and answers to some of the most common questions about this topic from my Thrivers Club community. So get ready for some real talk about which foods you may need to avoid. And unlike a lot of the clickbaity content that's out there on this topic, we're going to do it without the food fear. My goal for today is to empower you to make the best and most informed choices for your health. So if you're ready to take charge of your thyroid health, this episode is for you. Hello, Thyroid Thrivers, and welcome back to another episode of the Thyroid-Healthy Bites Podcast, with bi-weekly episodes dedicated to helping you eat well, live well, and feel well. I'm Ginny Mahar, a functional medicine health coach, cordon bleu chef, and your thyroid health and cooking coach. So if you're ready to get inspired, informed, and empowered with thyroid-friendly food and lifestyle topics, expert interviews, and tales from the healing journey, you're in the right place, friend. Let's dig in. Hello, Thyroid Thrivers, and welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most common questions I get asked: what foods and drinks do I need to avoid to support my thyroid? Or if I have hypothyroidism, or if I have Hashimoto's, or if I'm living without a thyroid. If you caught my recent YouTube episode, you know that I shared these top 5 offenders that might be worth avoiding if you're living with hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, or without a thyroid. And today we're going to go beyond that basic list that I shared on YouTube and dig into why these foods can be problematic. We'll look at the science behind it, and we'll look at some practical ways to figure out if these changes are right for you. So what you'll learn in this episode is why gluten is the number 1 dietary trigger for thyroid patients. We'll talk about the surprising truth about dairy and its impact on thyroid antibodies. We'll talk about how sugar, caffeine, and alcohol all can disrupt thyroid health and what to do about it. And we'll look at a simple approach to identifying your food sensitivities. And here's the fun part. I'll also be answering some great questions from my Thrivers Club members about this topic. So get comfy, grab a cup of tea and something to take notes with, and let's dig in. First up, we're going to talk about the number 1 dietary trigger for thyroid patients, which is, drumroll, gluten. I bet a lot of you already knew what I was going to say there. And if you've been in my world for a while, you know that gluten comes up a lot. This is why all of my recipes on Hypothyroid Chef are gluten-free. And most of the people in my Thrivers Club community, myself included, are also gluten-free. Gluten is often the first food that thyroid patients are told to eliminate, especially those of us with autoimmune thyroid conditions like Hashimoto's. So let's talk about why. Gluten contains proteins that mimic the structure of thyroid tissue. This is a really kind of wild phenomenon called molecular mimicry. So molecular mimicry is like a case of mistaken identity in your immune system. With Hashimoto's, your body's already attacking your thyroid, and then you eat gluten and the proteins in it look very similar to thyroid tissue. So your immune system goes, oh, hey, more bad guys, we're supposed to attack them, and then amps up the autoimmune response. And this creates more thyroid antibodies and attacks more and more of your thyroid tissue over time. So this is why so many people with Hashimoto's often notice a big difference when they cut out gluten. It's like calming down that inflammatory autoimmune fire. Okay, well, this doesn't always happen. I have known and worked with a few people who were able to actually reverse their autoimmune thyroid disease by cutting out gluten. But even if you don't achieve remission, maybe you're able to lower antibodies. Maybe you're able to heal your gut. There's a lot of big turnarounds that I have seen happen for thyroid patients who cut out gluten. Now, autoimmunity is the body attacking itself, right? And with Hashimoto's or Graves' disease, it's the body attacking the thyroid. And over time, that can destroy more and more thyroid tissue. And this is why many, if not most of us, especially if we're further along in the progression of our disease, we might feel a lot better from eliminating gluten. We might be able to calm and control that autoimmune response, but we're likely still going to require lifelong thyroid medication. I want to mention that because there's no shame in that, okay? It doesn't mean you did it wrong. It doesn't mean you didn't try hard enough. The bottom line is when there's so much damage that has been done to the thyroid, you're probably going to need a little help making the thyroid hormone that your body needs to function. And your body really does need that thyroid hormone to function. Now, a big part of the problem with gluten is that it can also be a major contributor to what's known clinically as intestinal permeability. So this is known in, the more like public sphere commonly as leaky gut, which is very common in thyroid patients. So leaky gut allows food particles to escape the intestinal wall and leak into your bloodstream. And that can trigger inflammation and also potentially worsen autoimmune conditions. This is kind of like if we, rewind a little bit to that whole like molecular mimicry thing. It's like this is how the autoimmune attack starts. You have leaky gut, the gluten particles escape the intestinal wall, they get into your bloodstream, the immune system launches that attack on the gluten, which ultimately becomes an attack on the thyroid because the molecular structure of gluten and thyroid tissue are so similar. So hopefully that's all making sense and I'm doing an okay job of explaining that. Here's a really powerful statistic around gluten. There was a survey conducted by Dr. Isabella Wentz of, I think it was over 2,000 thyroid patients, and she found that over 75% of Hashimoto's patients who went gluten-free reported an improvement in symptoms. I know for me, going gluten-free has been a very key factor of my own health turnaround, and there's several thyroid experts out there who will insist and do insist that all thyroid patients should be gluten-free. That's not all thyroid experts. I think there's some differing opinions on that. My approach to this personally is, I want to empower you with information so that you can determine for yourself if eliminating gluten is right for you. So I don't take that hardline stance that all thyroid patients need to be 100% gluten-free. But I have seen enough major health transformations from thyroid thrivers who have eliminated gluten that I feel that eliminating gluten, like just as a trial, as an experiment, is at least worth a shot. So if you're curious and have never gone gluten-free, an elimination trial is the best way to see how gluten affects you. And we'll talk briefly about how to do that a little bit later in today's episode. My process of really transitioning gluten out of my life and going entirely gluten-free took a while. And part of that was because I just wasn't noticing the negative effects of occasional gluten. And by occasional, I mean like less than once a month. And when I have gotten comprehensive testing done, which is fairly regularly, I also have never shown markers for leaky gut, like zonulin, for example, is one of those leaky gut markers. But what I did notice was that if I went down the slippery gluten slope and ate a bunch of gluten, like over and over, I would end up with what I've come to know as my very common gluten-related symptoms. Like I get dry, flaky skin on my face, I get bloated, I get more joint pain. One kind of weird symptom that I notice is that I get grouchy from gluten. I am kind of a unicorn in that way, in that I haven't really shown negative effects from very occasional gluten. And the trouble for most people who are sensitive to gluten is that even just one bite can trigger an inflammatory reaction in the body that can take weeks or months to turn off. So as the saying goes with gluten, one bite of bread can be just as bad as eating the whole loaf. So I do want to be clear about that with gluten, where for most people it really does require total elimination. With some foods, you may have a certain amount that you can get away with. And Gluten is typically not like that. For most people, it does take total elimination for those who are reactive to gluten. I think there's a lot we don't know about gluten and why so many people are sensitive to it. But wheat in particular, which is our primary source of gluten, has been so modified from its original form, like from its ancient origins, like einkorn, for example, that it really has become a problem for our gut health. Also, glyphosate is often mentioned as a problematic substance that's used not only to grow wheat, but to keep it dry and free of mold after harvesting. And glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, is horrible for our gut health. Absolutely horrible. So I've known people who have reversed their Hashimoto's from eliminating wheat and only wheat. And I've known thyroid patients who have reported that certain types of gluten, like einkorn, which is that ancient form of wheat, or sourdough breads, where the gluten strands are broken down by the fermentation process of the sourdough, some people report that they're better able to tolerate those types of gluten-containing foods. But yeah, in the expert community, there's some disagreement out there regarding whether we all as thyroid patients need to be 100% gluten-free or not. I'm personally not convinced based on the lack of consensus, basically, amongst the experts, as well as what I've seen in my Thrivers Club community, as well as my own personal experience. I also think it would be a bummer to eliminate a food, any food, for no good reason. That's a problem that can actually run kind of rampant in the thyroid and autoimmune community, is people hearing someone say, this food is bad, and then they eliminate it forever and ever for no good reason. And there are some nutritional risks to that. But I'm always learning, I'm always listening and keeping my ear to the ground. So maybe something will change my thinking about that. I do definitely feel that gluten is a red flag food for all thyroid patients. It doesn't necessarily mean that every single thyroid patient is going to benefit from eliminating it, but, a lot of people do. So in my mind, it's worth a shot, right? Cutting out gluten is a really common topic of conversation in the Thrivers Club. A lot of members have shared their experiences with going gluten-free. There's been symptom improvement, symptom reversal, people able to reduce their reliance on medication. There's been a lot of gut healing that has happened for people from eliminating gluten. So, I've definitely seen the benefits of it for sure. Another thing we talk about a lot are the challenges of finding things like a decent gluten-free bread or pasta. So it's a journey. There's some easy pitfalls when you're going gluten-free, but having a supportive community can really make a world of difference there, because it can be a lot to navigate. Okay, moving on. Food number 2 is dairy. Now, this one's a bit more nuanced. A lot of people assume, they hear dairy and they think, oh, right, lactose. That's the culprit, right? Lactose is the sugar in dairy. It's a sugar that's found in dairy. And for some people, that's true, that lactose is the problem. But for many thyroid patients, the issue is not lactose. It can also be casein, which is a protein found in all dairy, including cow's milk, goat's milk, sheep's milk. It's also found in whey. Some other people, can also be sensitive to whey in particular. So there's different aspects of dairy that people can be sensitive to. And this is why it's really important to choose the right protein powder, for example, because a lot of protein powders are made with whey protein, which is a dairy product, basically, which for some people can be very inflammatory. And whey protein is in a lot of protein bars too. So I just mentioned that as something to watch out for. But the takeaway here is that it's not only the lactose that can be problematic with dairy. Casein can be highly inflammatory for some people, can cause digestive upset, can contribute to leaky gut, and can contribute to an increase in thyroid antibody levels or autoimmune activity. One of my Thrivers Club members, Barbara, recently asked this question, does lactose-free dairy help if I have a dairy sensitivity? And, this really highlights how different our reactions can be. And the gist of it is that lactose-free products only help if your problem is lactose. But if you're sensitive to the casein or the whey or something else in the whey or the dairy, lactose-free dairy isn't going to make a lick of difference. So the best way to figure this out is to do an elimination reintroduction trial, which is considered the gold standard for identifying food sensitivities. If you can tolerate dairy, it's a really great source of calcium and probiotics and can be a very health supportive food. But if you don't tolerate it, there's plenty of plant-based alternatives you can choose from. Almond milk, coconut yogurt, cashew cheeses, all kinds of dairy-free and gluten-free for that matter, products are available to us these days. And in my community, I see less people being sensitive to dairy, but still, a very significant, many, if not most people in my community are sensitive to dairy in addition to gluten as thyroid patients, which is, what the research, what the experts also are saying. If you're wondering whether you could tolerate goat's or sheep's milk or some other kind of dairy, you could try reintroducing those one at a time to see if you can detect a reaction. For me, I actually found that dairy was more of an issue than gluten, especially in the beginning. And when I cut it out, it helped me get rid of bloating and joint pain, like right away. I noticed more benefits in the beginning from cutting out dairy than I did from cutting out gluten. And I'm still mostly dairy-free today. But over time, I have found that I'm able to tolerate some small amounts of certain types of dairy, like a little bit of aged raw milk cheese here and there. So we're talking things like a true Parmesan Reggiano or true Asiago or Romano cheese. Those are all aged raw milk cheeses. Those are no problem for me. And if I have a recipe that requires a little dairy, like say I'm making some gluten-free pancakes, right? I'll use buttermilk, which is cultured dairy. So this is kind of like the sourdough bread phenomenon where with cultured dairy, like buttermilk, the dairy is broken down by that beneficial bacteria and is therefore easier to digest. What gets me still is like regular ice cream or a glass of cow's milk. Like I honestly just feel kind of sick even thinking about it. But I have so many other alternatives to that, like coconut milk ice cream or my homemade almond milk. So I really don't even want to reintroduce those foods. But if it gives you some peace of mind, yeah, as I've healed, I've been able to reintroduce some types of dairy, and that is not uncommon. A lot of people find when they're able to heal, they are sometimes able to reintroduce foods. Recently, I've even been experimenting with like Greek yogurt, which is very high in protein. And again, it's cultured like those aged cheeses or the buttermilk. And I think it's going well, which is nice because it's given me a little more food freedom. So dairy, I think, is a good example of why it's important to not put foods into the bad pile just because they might be inflammatory for some people. Dairy is a great source of protein and calcium, and it can be a really great source of probiotics for those who tolerate it. Now, for those who don't, the experts agree here that it really is best to avoid it, because if you're sensitive to dairy and it's causing a lot of symptoms and contributing to this cycle of inflammation, leaky gut, autoimmunity in your body, it's not worth it. There are other sources of calcium and protein and probiotics out there. So if you're sensitive to dairy, it's not because dairy is inherently a bad food. It's that this healthy food isn't healthy for you, or at least isn't healthy for you right now. Hey Thyroid Thrivers, Ginny here. I just want to pop in with a quick message that if you're listening to today's show and thinking, I'm ready to learn more about this thyroid healing journey, about what foods to eat, what foods to avoid, one of the best ways to do it is to sign up for my free thyroid-friendly grocery guide. This features over 130 delicious, colorful, nutrient-dense foods we can eat. So this list is gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free, refined sugar-free, and free of processed foods. Because there can be a lot of emphasis, especially when we're starting out, on all that we can't have and all that we're supposed to avoid. But really, the purpose of thyroid-friendly eating is to incorporate more of the good stuff. So, to grab your copy instantly of the Thyroid Friendly Grocery Guide, you can go to hypothyroidchef.com/grocery. I'll send you the guide, and you'll also get put on my free weekly newsletter. So, you'll get fresh recipes, you'll get updates on the podcast, you'll get personal notes from me, special discounts, and all kinds of goodies that I send out to my mailing list for free just once a week. So go ahead and grab that at hypothyroidchef.com/grocery. Okay, back to the show. All right, so we've talked about gluten and dairy, which are two major staples in the standard American diet, right? Like, think about it. The pizza, the bagels, the sandwiches, the burgers, the pasta, all of them are made primarily of gluten and dairy. And I don't think that's a coincidence that those foods that we can tend to rely on way too heavily in the standard American diet, at the cost of other more nourishing, health-supporting foods like fruits and vegetables, high-quality animal protein, and healthy fats, those inflammatory foods, or those foods have, those staples have become inflammatory to the point of sparking disease in the body. And the same goes for the next food that I'm going to point the finger at here as a food that most of us should avoid or at least greatly reduce in our diets. Can you guess what it is? Sugar. Sugar is everywhere, isn't it? It's in the flavored coffee creamer, it's in the healthy granola bars, it's in the so-called healthy yogurt. For thyroid patients, sugar can be especially harmful because it disrupts our blood sugar balance. And that can cause this unhappy domino effect of promoting inflammation and then impacting our immune function. It's this inflammatory domino effect, and most Americans are eating way too much sugar, especially if you're doing a lot of processed foods and drinks. So here's a shocking fact. The average American consumes about 17 teaspoons of added sugar daily. That's nearly triple the recommended amount. So keep in mind, this doesn't include naturally occurring sugars in foods like sweet potatoes and apples and celery and, even vegetables have some naturally occurring sugars in them, right? This is added sugar. And that added sugar, like the cookies or the sodas or the candy, boy, it gets you hooked so fast. Like, seriously, have you ever, probably a lot of you have experienced this, where you've cut out sugar and then one day you break down and you have like one gluten-free cookie or whatever, and the next day you want 2 cookies. And then the day after that, you want 3 cookies. And then the next thing you know, you're right back on that cycle where you're reaching for sugar throughout the day without even really consciously realizing it. Sugar, it's really bad news. Along with being a major contributor to inflammation, excessive sugar intake is strongly linked to serious health risks like heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and even cognitive decline like Alzheimer's and dementia, which is now sometimes referred to as type 3 diabetes. And these are some of the most common, deadliest diseases we have in our culture. More and more research is pointing to the far-reaching negative health impacts of sugar. And it really makes it clear that cutting back on sugar is good for everyone, really. It's essential for our overall well-being. It's really important for those of us with thyroid issues because, you know what? Sugar feels like an energy booster, kind of like caffeine. And a lot of us are working from a limited supply of energy. So we turn to sugar because we're like, I'm flagging. I need a little boost. But the long-term effects of getting in that sugar habit, that chronic sugar habit, and eating a diet that's really high in added sugar, especially with an underactive or missing thyroid, can pose some very real risks. We're already more prone as thyroid patients to slower metabolism and metabolic syndrome. We're more prone to insulin resistance and increased inflammation. We're more prone to high cholesterol and obesity. And you add to that having low energy, a lot of us, or mental health issues like depression is very common. And that can make it hard to maintain healthy habits like getting regular exercise. So with this stuff already knocking at our door, we kind of have to ask ourselves, how can we take back control and protect our health for the long haul? And that's really what we're trying to answer in this episode. And cutting down on sugar, especially added sugar, this is like low-hanging fruit, especially the excessive consumption of added sugar. It's a no-brainer, right? This is one of those areas where there's very little disagreement anymore in the research and among the experts. And I don't like to demonize foods. I don't like to put anything in the bad pile. I'm not talking about the occasional cookie, but it's the habitual daily consumption of excess sugar that is really worth taking a hard look at. In the Thrivers Club, reducing sugar is what I see commonly as one of the most rewarding changes that people can make. One of my members recently shared how she had cut back on sugary snacks, and it really helped stabilize her energy levels and reduce her afternoon crashes. In my recipes on Hypothyroid Chef and in the Thrivers Club, I like to use natural sweeteners like honey or maple syrup in small amounts. That's kind of my strategy. So sugar is sugar. We're not going to pretend that, honey and maple syrup are like health foods per se, but they are a more natural option, and they do have some health benefits, like I would say more health benefits versus sugar. Like maple syrup, for example, is very high in polyphenols. Honey is very high in antioxidants. Another favorite strategy I use to cut down on the amount of sugar that I use in sweet recipes especially is adding spices like cinnamon that can naturally enhance the sweetness without adding excess sugar. And funny enough, cinnamon can also help with blood sugar balance, so it's a win-win. The key is really moderation and focusing on progress, not perfection. So if you're going to have a piece of cake, enjoy it. But be honest with yourself about your daily sugar choices and really ask, where can I cut back? Where can I replace some of this added sugar with other healthier forms of sugar? Like, can I trade the cookies for a piece of fruit? Can I try making baked goods with less added sugar, or try some, smaller amounts of natural sugars versus large amounts of refined white sugar? It's worth it. And your health will thank you. And what we do when we start making these changes is we actually retrain our palates. So you can get off of it. There a lot of that drive towards sugar. It's like a built-in chemical reward system that's very similar to being hooked on drugs. We can wean ourselves off sugar. We can lose a taste for it over time. So I know it can be very hard at first, and there's a lot of cravings and stuff. I have a lot of resources on this in the Thrivers Club for people who are trying to break that sugar habit. It's very common. It's and it's very human too. We're kind of hardwired to want those calorie-rich foods. That's our innate survival mechanism saying, put on some fat, eat the sugary, fatty foods, because there could be a famine just around the bend, and we need to be ready for that. Right? So a lot of us have that hard wiring, some of us more than others. It's just a human thing, but it is something that can very much be overcome. Okay, so we've covered gluten, dairy, and sugar. There are other foods that can be problematic. We're not going to get into all of them today, but I do want to mention that there are plenty of otherwise healthy foods many times that can be problematic for some of us. So some things that come to mind are foods like eggs, corn, soy, nightshades, or even like grains in general. And honestly, there's a ton of territory we could cover here, but it's really just too much for one episode. So we're going to stick to the top 5 culprits. And the next 2 that we're actually going to talk about are not so much foods, but drinks. So moving on to the number 4 dietary culprit thyroid thrivers may need to avoid is caffeine. Caffeine is one of those things that people in my community either love or they kind of struggle with, as in they're like, this doesn't make me feel good. For thyroid patients, the issue isn't just the caffeine, it's what it does to your adrenal glands. So caffeine triggers your adrenals to release cortisol and adrenaline, and that can create a state of stress in the body. And over time, that can contribute to adrenal fatigue, which can leave you feeling even more tired. So you keep ramping up the caffeine because you feel tired, and it ultimately makes you more tired. And then, next thing you know, you're having a quad shot in the morning, and it can become this kind of vicious cycle. I actually talked about this in depth on a very recent episode of Thyroid-Healthy Bites, where I interviewed Dr. Isabella Wentz about adrenal health. And one of the main takeaways from our conversation is that excessive caffeine can be really hard on your adrenals, and your adrenals and your thyroid are closely intertwined. So if you're blasting your body with a lot of excess caffeine and therefore excess cortisol as a side effect of drinking all that caffeine, it can really do a number on your energy levels, on your thyroid hormones, on your stress hormones, and so much more. This is another unhappy domino effect, right? The good news here is that what a lot of the experts recommend now, including Dr. Wentz, is not eliminating caffeine entirely, but more so avoiding excess caffeine. So 1 to 2 cups a day. And remember, a cup is 8 ounces, right? So that venti coffee drink is actually 3 times that. Some people also find that certain types of caffeine are harder to tolerate than others. Coffee in particular can be kind of notoriously rough on the gut, hard on your blood sugar, can lead to symptoms like jitters, sweats, anxiety. One thing we end up talking about a lot in the Thrivers Club are coffee alternatives like matcha or herbal teas or even half-calf blends. For me, making the switch to drinking matcha in the morning and maybe a cup of green tea in the afternoon has made a really big difference for me. I've never been a big coffee drinker. I love the taste of it, but I have always been kind of sensitive to it. Like, it doesn't really agree with me. I get shaky. I can feel that blood sugar roller coaster happening. I get the sweats, if I drink it, say I drink it every day for like a week, I will definitely feel it in my stomach, where my stomach lining will get kind of sensitive. Now, matcha and green tea do not have that same effect because they actually release caffeine more slowly. And that's thanks to an amino acid called L-theanine. So L-theanine helps promote calm and focus and balances out the stimulating effects of caffeine. And that in turn results in like a more steady energy boost without that harsh spike and crash cycle, without the jitters, without anxiety, without the crashes a few hours later that coffee can sometimes cause. Now, for thyroid patients, this can be especially helpful because we're often more sensitive to those blood sugar swings and to the stress that those put on our adrenals. Plus, matcha and green tea are also packed with antioxidants, which supports our overall health. It helps reduce inflammation. Those are both key things for thriving with a thyroid condition. So if you're curious, you can check out my recipes for a dairy-free matcha latte, either hot or iced, on the blog. I'll put that link in the show notes for you in case you want to give it a try. If coffee doesn't sit well with you, there's other gentler alternatives you can experiment with, like green tea. It can be a great way to enjoy your morning ritual while also supporting your body's unique needs. It's just about finding what works for you. Okay, finally, let's talk about culprit number 5, which is alcohol. So beyond the, commonly known impacts alcohol has on the liver, which is critical for thyroid hormone conversion, by the way, is your liver health. Alcohol can disrupt your gut microbiome. It can interfere with your sleep. It can mess with your hormones. Like, the list goes on. And in the Thrivers Club, we often focus on these small, doable changes, and cutting back on alcohol is one of those things that can have a very big ripple effect. One member recently shared how reducing that regular nightly glass of wine really improved her energy and her mood. She was really kind of awakening to the more negative impacts this was having, that she didn't really realize how much it was affecting her sleep, her energy the next day, until she cut that out. For me, I started really making a conscious effort to cut down on alcohol in recent years, really work towards cutting it out for the most part. And one of my biggest health wins is that I have now reached my goal with this and have really gotten to where I want to be, which is that alcohol is, for me, it's like a rare indulgence, that I save for social gatherings and for celebrations, for like special meals, birthdays, things like that. It's not a part of my daily life the way it used to be when I was younger. I did make the decision that I wanted to still have the option. I didn't want to take a hardline stance with it personally. Now, everybody has their own journey with this. I do realize addiction can be a factor for some people. So this is just my experience. But since I've cut it out, except for, those rare occasions, I've noticed huge improvements in my sleep and energy levels, and especially my gut health. So it's been a process. I started by going, for months at a time. Then I ended up eventually going for an entire year without any alcohol. That really was like the turning point in like getting out of the, just the habitual, like, oh, I'm going to have a something to drink while I'm making dinner or whatever that I used to be more in the habit of doing when I was younger. I just got out of the habit of doing that. And eventually, it's like, I just don't even crave it anymore. So this is an area where we all have to kind of walk our own path, have patience with our process, make our own choices. But I do want to mention it because it is one of those things where people can be working really hard on what they're eating. They're working really hard to get those workouts in and make all these other healthy choices. And there can be a very common blind spot to that glass or two of wine every night, or just how alcohol in general is taking a toll on their gut health, their hormonal balance, their weight, their sleep. It doesn't take a lot of alcohol to have those negative effects. So the list of negative effects does go on. So just like it's worth tuning in and noticing how each of these things affects you, it's worth tuning in and noticing and experimenting with how alcohol affects you. How do you feel when you cut it out? So there you have it, the 5 primary foods and drinks to avoid if you are a thyroid thriver. Number 1, gluten. Number 2, dairy. Number 3, sugar. Number 4, caffeine, especially excessive caffeine. And number 5, alcohol. As I mentioned before, there are other foods that can be problematic for some people. This is a bio-individual endeavor, right? But it really depends on the person. These are 5 that are more in that realm where most of us should really be looking at our consumption of these and start paying attention to how they make us feel. Because you know what? The body gives us a lot of feedback around these things if we just tune in and listen. You don't feel good when you drink alcohol every night and then counter that with a huge sugary coffee drink in the morning and then eat lots of gluten, dairy, and sugar throughout the day. But sure enough, that's what a lot of people do day after day after day. And here in the US, we have the dismal health statistics to prove it. And when it comes to feeling your best, when it comes to having the energy that you want, when it comes to keeping your inflammation down and living your best life, thyroid disease or not, that's not the recipe for it. The recipe is not gluten, dairy, sugar, caffeine, and alcohol as a lifestyle, right? The recipe is a diverse diet, a colorful diet with plenty of whole foods, plant foods, high quality protein, and healthy fats. Also adequate hydration using filtered water. These are the pillars of thyroid-friendly eating. So just an FYI, all of my recipes are gluten and dairy free and free of refined sugar. I've also got a ton of recipes on my blog that feature caffeine and alcohol-free beverage options. If you're ready to sink your teeth into this and make a huge step on your healing journey by identifying what foods you need to avoid, I've got you covered. You can check out my signature course. This is exactly what I created it for. It's called the Thyroid-Friendly Meal Plan Kickstart, where I walk you through a super empowering, doable, simple 4-week program to help you identify what your unique dietary sensitivities are so that you can leverage the power of your food and beverage choices to feel your best and thrive. Okay, I know a lot of you have questions about this, so before we sign off today, I'm going to answer some of those for you. First, how do you know if you're sensitive to a food? There's many ways that food sensitivities can manifest, and the symptoms aren't always intuitive. You might think that you'd always get stomach pain or digestive issues like bloating or gas or IBS symptoms, right? And those can certainly indicate a food sensitivity, especially if you are consistently getting those symptoms from a certain food, like dairy, for example. But oftentimes the symptoms are not digestive at all. You might have a skin rash. You might get migraines. A food could affect your mood. It could make your hands swell. It could trigger your anxiety. For Beth, one of my Thrivers Club members, she had been dealing with chronic insomnia for a long time, and she discovered through my program that eggs were the culprit. How did she identify this? Well, by cutting out eggs and noticing, oh my gosh, my insomnia went away. And then she reintroduced eggs and noticed that the insomnia came right back. She repeated this experiment a couple more times and confirmed that, sure enough, eggs were definitely linked to her sleep problems. So you have to slow down, pay attention, tune in, and listen. And the other part of this is that you have to be a good scientist here and really track your foods and symptoms carefully. I provide all the tools you need to do this in that signature Kickstart course. And the cool thing about learning these skills is that once you've got them, you have them forever and ever. This is a tool that I know I've used over and over again on my thyroid healing journey. Beth continues to use these skills and tools to fine-tune her eating style and identify foods that just don't love her back. And doing so has actually enabled Beth to lose like 20 pounds. She's gotten back into running after years of not being able to run. Most recently, Beth was able to start a new job, which she wouldn't have been able to have the energy for a year and a half ago. So if that gives you any indication of why this is important and how much of a difference it can make, Beth's story is a really powerful example. Okay, another frequently asked question that I get in my community is, what about food sensitivity testing? Can't I just take a blood test and then that will tell me which foods I should avoid? There's some nuance here. Yes, you can do food sensitivity testing. A lot of experts recommend it, use it, swear by it, use it as a tool. The trouble with food sensitivity testing is that the results can be somewhat unreliable. There can be false positives, and that can result in you maybe avoiding a food that you don't really need to avoid. There can also be false negatives, like on my food sensitivity testing, it said that I had no sensitivity to gluten, when I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that I do. My skin will tell you very clearly that I have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, especially the skin around my mouth and chin. It gets really red and flaky and dry if I eat gluten as a staple in my diet. And as I mentioned before, I know I get other symptoms with regular gluten consumption as well, but that food sensitivity test showed that gluten wasn't a problem for me, that I could eat it on that food sensitivity test. And this was from a reputable lab, okay? It also told me that I shouldn't eat clams or pineapple, that I was reactive to both of those foods, both of which I have been able to enjoy without any noticeable issues. So, and I'm not eating those foods like on a daily basis, clams and pineapple, it's sort of something I might have once in a while. So I choose to eat those foods and enjoy those foods. There is no discernible negative effect of those. So why would I cut out these otherwise very nutrient-dense foods if I don't have to? If you want to know more about this, I did another episode on food sensitivity testing this season. So I will put a link to that in the show notes for you. But the answer is that yes, you can get a food sensitivity test, but the results may not be 100% reliable or reproducible. That doesn't mean the results are worthless. It means that food sensitivity testing can give us great clues as to what we might be sensitive to. So what do the experts say we should do with the results? Conduct an elimination trial of those foods to confirm the results. So again, that elimination or elimination reintroduction trial is still considered the gold standard of testing for and identifying food sensitivities. And the basic idea is that you cut out a certain food, typically for a minimum of 30 days. You track carefully how your symptoms change without that food. Then, if desired, you can attempt to reintroduce that food to see what happens. what symptoms come back, and then you've got a very clear picture of what foods cause which symptoms for you, and you can decide whether or not that food is right for you based on those symptoms. Now, food sensitivities are not the same as life-threatening food allergies, so this elimination reintroduction trial does not apply to those life-threatening food allergies that can cause things like anaphylaxis. So this is different. This is more like wow, I feel like I get really bloated when I eat dairy, or I feel like I get this recurring rash when I eat gluten, or whatever it is. There's a difference in the reactions. Again, we go into this in more detail on that podcast episode about food sensitivity testing. So you can turn to that if you want to learn more. There is a bit to this process, and it's honestly more than we have time to go into here, like the fact that you only want to reintroduce one food at a time, or which foods you should reintroduce in which order. But once you've got the basic process down and you have a solid system for tracking your symptoms to clearly identify those reactions, what food causes what symptoms for me, that's how you can discover the ultimate in personalized nutrition, which is a bio-individual diet comprised of foods that are right for you as an individual. Again, I have tons of resources available to you if you want to learn more about this. But before we wrap it up, let's tackle a couple more frequently asked questions. Someone asked, I don't have Hashimoto's, just hypothyroidism. Should I still avoid gluten? This is a great question. So, and I get this question a lot about thyroid healthy eating in general. And the strongest connection, I would say the biggest body of research between gluten and thyroid health is around autoimmune thyroid conditions like Hashimoto's. But many patients without Hashimoto's, or maybe they just haven't been tested for or diagnosed with Hashimoto's, which is very, very common. Many people in that camp, though, or who don't have Hashimoto's, thyroid patients who don't have autoimmunity or diagnosed autoimmunity, still report feeling better when they eliminate gluten. Gluten can trigger inflammation and gut issues in general, like for anyone. So it's worth experimenting to see how your body responds. See, a lot of the recommendations are the same, whether you have Hashimoto's, whether you have Graves', whether you're living without a thyroid, whether you've had a partial thyroidectomy or something like that, because a lot of us end up technically in the hypothyroid camp, meaning we need to rely on oftentimes supplemental thyroid hormone in order to have normal thyroid function, in order for our bodies to function, right? In that hypothyroid camp comes oftentimes, we'll say, compromised metabolism, compromised digestion, struggles with energy, struggles with sleep, weight, mood, gut health. So an anti-inflammatory diet is key. And one part of anti-inflammatory eating is eating more anti-inflammatory foods. And the other part of anti-inflammatory eating is avoiding inflammatory foods, including the foods that you, as a unique individual, are sensitive to. So remember the example that we talked about with dairy. For those who tolerate it, it's not an inflammatory food, it's a healthy food. But for those who are sensitive to it, it can be inflammatory. It can contribute to leaky gut and inflammation and autoimmunity, and that can make it a healthy food that isn't healthy for you. So that's why it's important to identify your unique dietary triggers. But also, a lot of these principles, a lot of the foods we talked about today, these are just part of functional nutrition. They're part of the dietary changes that are recommended by the Institute for Functional Medicine for anyone who wants to maintain optimal health, especially those of us living with chronic health issues. Okay? Anti-inflammatory eating, that's really kind of like the baseline that a lot of this comes down to. There was another question I wanted to mention from my Thrivers Club community. If I'm gluten-free, do I also need to avoid oats? So this is a really common question. Oats are naturally gluten-free, but they are very commonly cross-contaminated during processing. They're, processed on equipment that gluten-containing grains are processed on. And this is actually very common with oats, so it is important to look for certified gluten-free oats if you're avoiding gluten. It should say clearly on the package that they are certified gluten-free. I do occasionally cook with oats, eat oats. I like steel-cut oatmeal once in a while. I'm not a huge grain eater. If I eat too many grains, I get brain fog. But I do enjoy oats once in a while, and I absolutely make sure to purchase certified gluten-free oats. One final frequently asked question is switching to goat's milk better than cow's milk? We did kind of cover this a little bit, basically not necessarily. Why? Because goat's milk still contains casein, which can be problematic for some people. It also contains lactose. It depends on what you're reacting to in the dairy. If it's lactose, goat's and sheep's milk are slightly lower in lactose than cow's milk, but not by much. So again, that elimination reintroduction process is your best bet to see if there are certain types of dairy you can tolerate. And with any of these dietary changes, you of course want to work with your healthcare practitioner to decide which of these dietary experiments might be right for you, which of these dietary changes is worth you making, to have some professional medical guidance with that from someone who can take your entire health history into consideration. Because there are other, factors that some of us have beyond just thyroid stuff that impacts what kinds of foods are right for us and which ones aren't. And all of that plays in to that bio-individual approach to nutrition. So always lean on your professional healthcare providers for more guidance around that. All right, friends, we covered a lot of ground today, so let's wrap it up before our heads explode, okay? We explored 5 foods and drinks that might be worth avoiding if you're looking to optimize your thyroid health, including gluten, dairy, sugar, caffeine, and alcohol. We discussed why these foods can be problematic. We talked about how to identify which foods are problematic for you, and we shared practical tips to get started with the process of identifying your ideal thyroid-friendly, personalized diet. Finally, I shared some of the most frequently asked questions on this topic from my Thrivers Club members. If you'd like to be part of a supportive community where you can ask these kinds of questions, access expert workshops, learn alongside others who get it and who know what it's like to live with thyroid issues, you can check out the Thrivers Club community. It's a place just for thyroid thrivers like you and me who want to feel our best and thrive. It also gives you direct access to me. I'll include a link to learn more about that in the show notes. And I'll leave you with these final thoughts for today. Harnessing the healing power of food goes both ways, friends. We need to eat more of the foods that give us the nourishment to thrive and stay healthy, while also knowing which foods contribute to inflammation and disease so that we can make wise choices to minimize or avoid them. Food freedom is important, as is making room for those occasional indulgences without making ourselves super stressed out about them. And this can be a process that goes far beyond just the food on our plates. It starts in our minds. It starts with our willingness to listen to our bodies and to believe deeply enough in our own worth to feed ourselves in a way that elevates our health, energy, and vitality, while also finding the wiggle room that makes the lifestyle sustainable so that you can live and enjoy your life with balance. If you need help with that process, I'm here for you. I've got resources, recipes, and a thriving community waiting to help you reclaim your health. There's never been a better time to get started on that than today. Thanks so much for spending this time with me and tuning into today's episode of the Thyroid-Healthy Bites Podcast. If you've enjoyed today's show, please don't forget to like, subscribe, or leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. Your support makes this show possible. For more thyroid healthy food and lifestyle inspiration, check out my free library of thyroid-friendly recipes and lifestyle content at hypothyroidchef.com and the Hypothyroid Chef YouTube channel. As we wrap it up, head to the show notes for information and links to everything we talked about today, along with the link to my free thyroid-friendly grocery guide download. I'm Ginny Mahar, your thyroid health and cooking coach, wishing you happy cooking, happy thriving, and the best of health. See you next time.